And Jesus is saying it's the spiritual bread that we absolutely, positively have to have. We have to have the spiritual bread. Now today, we're going to take communion with bread that is 250 years old. Isn't that amazing? Right here. You're looking for the mold, aren't you? Saying, where did you dig this up? Like Julian Dubuque's grave or something? This is 250-year-old bread, and I think that's kind of cool. Let me tell you something. I got an education in bread baking this week with our worship dream team, sitting down and talking, thinking about this, praying about it, and giving me ideas. 250-year-old bread is because this sourdough bread, we're going to take communion with sourdough, came from a starter mix that Fran Hedeman bought, some years ago, and it goes back to 1761, before the American Revolution, is when the sourdough starter, it looks kind of like that. Maybe it's in a jar or in some kind of thing in Fran's refrigerator. So, does anybody here have sourdough starter in your fridge? Anybody do this? Not yet, but you will be after this week, won't you? 250 years old, that's a powerful symbol for what we're talking about today. On this day of talking about our saints, talking about how vital our saints are, to remember the saints of the Christian movement and the Christian lifestyle. And we remember them in that sense of a cloud of witnesses. But we're going to connect it really strongly to bread. Bread. Jesus said, I'm the bread of life. Jesus said, you have to have it. It's vital. So we connect it to our saints to bread. Our saints, those people, those real human beings, imperfect as they were, those real human beings who worked hard to follow the ways of Jesus Christ. That's who we're talking about, specifically. Sometimes some people make a mistake. I remember years ago when I did an All Saints Sunday and invited people to bring pictures of their saints. Okay, people who had died, but specifically people who had influenced them in the Christian faith. And so people just flooded me with photographs, and I had all these photographs up on the screen, and there were some people sitting out in the congregation, and they saw some of the photographs, and went, ooh, I thought these were people who were Christian examples, because there were people that weren't. They just had died. Y'all with me? So we are specifying. We're not being judgmental in a bad way, but specifically we're talking about those Christian men and women, moms and dads, grandpas, grandmas, friends, relatives, whatever it is, who followed Jesus and inspired us with the desire to do the same. And they've died. Those are our saints. Like this sourdough bread, sourdough saints. Sourdough starter has been what? It's been passed on. It's been passed on. We have this bread today for communion because someone over 250 years ago started passing it on, and then they made it available, and Fran Hedeman bought some of it. Cool. Sourdough bread because it's been passed on. Today we think about those people in our life, in your life, my life, in the life of Grandview United Methodist Church, who have been like sourdough, but they're sourdough saints. Because what they did, not just what they talked about, has been passed on. To drill down a little bit deeper, we think about the unique thing, or the vital thing, that makes certain people saints, and makes it different from those who aren't saints. There's something, a key ingredient. Now you're thinking about bread and you're smelling bread. What's the difference between a flat, lifeless, hard lump of flour and water and a bread that looks like this? Wait a minute. Wait for it. There it is. Can you almost taste that bread? What's the difference between flat, lifeless lump of dough and bread that looks like that? What's the difference? It's down in the corner there. What is it? Yeast. That's right. That's the difference. It's yeast. And that's what, when I said I wanted to drill down, that's what I want us to focus on. Yeast. Yeast. Okay? Bread like this, bread that's risen and has lots of flavor. When I was doing research this week, I found out that bread, similar to this, was discovered in ancient Egypt. You got these people outside in Egypt, ancient Egypt, and they're mixing up the flour and the water and a little salt and maybe some kind of sugar. And they're mixing it all up together outside, and they leave it out on a ledge or on a stone table, whatever it was. They left it there too long. And what happened is that these natural occurring yeast cells were in the air and they were all around. Maybe some of them might have been in the flour. And they stayed out there long enough that these ancient Egyptians came back, and all of a sudden, what was going to be a little flat, lifeless, flavorless lump of dough had risen. And they said, hey, this is pretty cool. All of a sudden, we have bread that has lift, it's lifted up, and it has this strength, it's got character in it and flavor. That's how I understood bread came about, how it was discovered. Yes? Children's church, all right. Keep going. Go. Please. All right. We got to figure out our system on doing that. All right? Because now I'm going to have to start my sermon over so you get it. All right. Let's get that figured out. Let me tell you a little bit more about bread making, because I did a big time. Children, you can go out to children's church, and usually we don't have that on Communion Sunday, so forgive me for being taken by surprise by that. Flour, water. You can see the ingredients right down here. Flour, water, yeast, sugar, and some salt. Now this is what bread is. This is what all comes together. You mix it together, you put it in a bowl or whatever, or a bread machine for some of us modern folks. You mix it together, you get it the right consistency, you knead it, right? You're kneading it, you're working it around, and then there's this fermentation that takes place. It's a chemical reaction. It's a cellular thing. It's a cellular thing. You got the yeast and the water that produce alcohol and carbon dioxide. And the yeast feeds on the carbohydrates in the flour. And then the sugar content, the sugar, let me get this right in case I want to go home and bake some bread today. The salt brings out the flavor, keeps the sugar content low so there isn't over-fermentation. And this chemical reaction happens, we get something that looks like that. Can you almost taste it, yes? Yeah. You know what bread is. See, remember, it's something we know about. Bread is something that's known to help us teach us about the unknown. Okay? But here's where I'm going with this. The yeast is the key ingredient. Okay? If we don't have the yeast, we don't have the lift. If we don't have the yeast, we don't have the strengthening of the gluten. That's part of the chemical reaction. Okay? The gluten is what keeps the bread from like exploding, looking like Swiss cheese. The strength of the gluten, the natural occurring things in the flour, is what keeps it together. But if we don't have the yeast, and that's some starter bread, we don't have the lift. We don't have the strength. And we don't have the character or the flavor in the bread. Again, Sourdough Saints. We're talking about something that's known as a way to understand the unknown. We're talking about something that's vital to us and something we know about to understand how vital God is to us. Now here's the thing. On the side of that, a little while ago we saw some pictures of like Red Star and Fleischmann's yeast. And the way this works is that before those things could be bought in a store, like on the frontier or whatever, they couldn't go buy yeast in a store. So what they did, whether it was sourdough or regular yeast bread, is they had to pass on. They had to pass on some starter dough. They had to pass on some starter dough, a little chunk saved from like the big batch. They had to cut off like a cup and save it so they could pass it on for the next batch. They had to save it so they could save it for the next generation. And that's the next step we take in understanding this. Saints are those Christian men and women who have passed on the ingredients. They have passed on and passed down the methods, the essentials, the ways to behave, the expectations needed to have bread. More specifically, our saints have passed on those practices, attitudes, habits, the essentials, including the yeast. They've passed it on to the next generations so that we can be bread. Because Jesus said, I am the bread of life. And he said, this bread is vital for life. And it gives life to the world. Bread, like that texture, like vital signs. Jesus said, I am the bread of life, and I give light and life to the world. The way this works is, that's us. The way God planned it, the way God created it, is that the church, not the building, not the structure of bricks and mortar. The way Jesus set this up in the way God planned it is, the people who call themselves Christians are now charged with being bread. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. I have come to feed the world and give light and life to the world. That's us now. We are to be the living, breathing, doing, hands, feet, face, mouth of Jesus Christ in the world. Not the building, the people. Jesus is a way to think about this, just to make sure, if you're keeping score here, and I hope you are, Jesus was the original sourdough, the original starter dough, if you will. And part of him was passed on to the people that we recognize as saints. Whether they're the saints that have statues made of them and are glorified and beautified and all that kind of stuff, or the people that you list in your head and in your heart. The moms, the dads, the grandpas, the grandmas, the pastors, the Sunday school teachers. Jesus, and part of Jesus' practices, essentials, ingredients, yeast, was passed on from Jesus to the saints. And the sourdough saints passed it to us. And they passed it to us, and what's supposed to be happening, and probably is happening to a certain degree, is lift and strength and character. You know? One of the other ways to think about this is that our saints have handed down a culture. Now, you know, I'm not a science guy, not a big biology guy, but I understand that yeast and this chemical thing is like a culture, right? Is everybody, give me an amen if you understand that, yes? Amen. It's culture. Ooh, there's a powerful word, a big word. Our saints have given us a culture of Jesus. They've given us a culture of Christian attitudes and Christian behaviors, Christian practices, a Christian culture. The Christian men and women before us, they gave us this. They were vital bread for the life of the church and for the Christian lifestyle. They passed on the Christian culture. You all get it, right? Say yes. Yes? You get it? All right, so here's the challenging part. So what are we doing with it? What are we doing with it? That's the challenging part for me and everybody else. On All Saints Sunday, we remember the importance of those who came before us, that were the starter dough, the sourdough saints, that handed it on for lift and strength and character. And the question is, what are we doing with it? And I'm talking to all of us in the room. Are we baking bread and being bread and feeding those who will come after us? That's the big question. This week I read a survey. The National Church Life Survey came out several years ago. And they talked to thousands of Protestant men and women, thousands. And they asked them a lot of questions. And one of the things that came out of that is that 75% of those who became Christian before age 10 said it was because of their parents' influence. Yeast, starter, lift, strength, character. 75% of those who were Christians, who called themselves followers of Christ, said that they came to that decision, 75%, because of their parents. 68% of teenagers and young adults list the influence of parents and pastors and church members and church leaders. 68% said it's those folks who gave them the lift, the strength, who gave them the Christian character, who provided a culture for them to make that kind of decision. Man, I read statistics like that, and I read those because part of our challenge, and big challenge, in the United Methodist Church, and I think for all of Christendom, all of the church, is that we are losing generations of people. Did you know that? We are losing generations of people. So I read statistics like this, and I say, wow, 75% to 68% of people, future Christians, it comes down to us and how we act and what we do and what we say. By the way, over almost 70% of these people who were interviewed said it was the way that these people lived out their faith. It was the way that they treated other people. It was their attitudes. It was their actions. More so than whether their parents or other church members could explain the faith, whether they could articulate what it meant. In other words, what people say, what these generations of young people and teenagers and young adults and people who were in the church, who were part of the body, What they're saying is that being a sour